Did you know that a Japanese soldier hid in the jungle for 29 years, not realizing that the war was over? Or maybe you've heard about the American president who miraculously avoided being eaten by cannibals. These amazing facts, which seem unreal, are absolutely true. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Just mention the Great Emu War, the Mad Emperor, and Lenin's brain for the concentration of absurdity to reach its peak. History is full of extraordinary events, and I invite you to discover those that you certainly did not hear about in school. The Emperor's Last Soldier. Hiro Onoda's dream has always been to become a soldier and serve Japan. At the age of 21, he enlisted in the Imperial Army, where he was trained in intelligence activities and guerrilla warfare. In December 1944, together with a small group of commandos, he was sent to the Philippine island of Lubang in order to make the American landing as difficult as possible. As long as you have at least one soldier, you are to command him. You may have to subsist on coconuts. If this happens, you are to eat them. Under no circumstances must you surrender. This was the order he received from his superior, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. The island's defense ended in defeat. American troops landed on Lubang on February 28, 1945, and broke Japanese resistance without major problems. Most of the defenders were killed or captured, but a few managed to retreat into the densely forested hills, which allowed the soldiers to remain hidden and continue the guerrilla war. Among them was Hiro and 3 of his men. A few months later, the war ended, and American planes dropped leaflets over the island informing the soldiers there about the surrender of Japan. Onoda's group ignored the call to surrender, considering it a ruse, and continued fighting with the Filipino population and local law enforcement forces. After 4 long years, one of the group members left his companions and surrendered to the Philippine Army. He reported that 3 of his comrades still believed that the war was ongoing. After 2 more years, family photographs were dropped over the island. Onoda and his 2 companions remained determined to fight to the death. Years passed, and the men continued to hide in the forest. They lived in tragic conditions, sleeping in makeshift huts made of branches and eating coconuts and bananas. At one point, one of the comrades was killed by locals, while the other was shot during an attack on a food warehouse. Onoda became the last Japanese soldier to fight in World War II. Although he was pronounced dead in December 1959, numerous attacks suggested that Hiro may still be alive. In February 1974, it was found by a Japanese student traveling in the region. Onoda still did not believe that the war was over. He replied that he would never surrender unless he received an order to lay down his weapons from his superior. Thanks to the help of the Japanese government, Major Taniguchi was found, and interestingly, he was still alive. He flew to the island and personally gave the order to lay down weapons. After 29 years, Hiro returned to Japan, where he was welcomed as a national hero. Throughout his life, he avoided the attention he attracted. He considered Japan at that time to be a poor shadow of the former dignified empire for which he had devoted many years. His belief was that if other soldiers had fought with the same dedication as he, Japan would have been victorious in the war. The President and the Cannibals. In early September 1944, American pilots conducted an air raid on the Japanese island of Chichijima. During the operation, 9 of them were shot down, but only 8 were captured by the Japanese. The only pilot who managed to avoid capture was then 20-year-old George Herbert Walker Bush, the future President of the United States. He flew the damaged machine to the maximum possible distance, then inflated the raft and swam away from the island. The drifting pilot was rescued by an American submarine. Unfortunately, Bush's other 8 comrades were not so lucky. American soldiers were tortured and then killed. 4 of them fell victim to cannibalism. Their livers and meat were prepared by cooks and then eaten by Japanese officers. The Great Emu War. In 1932, Australia fought one of the strangest wars in history. During those years, the emu population in Australia increased rapidly. These birds, having no natural enemies, fed on grain fields and pastures, causing significant damage to farmers. Under pressure from farmers, the government decided to take radical measures, exterminating the emu. Soldiers armed with machine guns were deployed to carry out operations against the birds. At first, the mission seemed easy. Emus were big and easy to hit. However, the birds turned out to be extremely agile and fast, able to escape from bullets and hide in dense vegetation. The war with the emu turned out to be an embarrassment. The soldiers were unable to decimate the emu population. In a few weeks, they killed only a few thousand birds while using huge amounts of ammunition. The operation was ultimately aborted, and the government had to admit defeat. This event is often cited as an example of absurd decisions and incompetence in military operations. Nowadays, it is a source of memes and anecdotes, and the story of the Great Emu War remains one of the strangest chapters in Australian history. The Mad Emperor. Caligula was one of the most controversial emperors of the Roman Empire. He gave orders that seemed absurd, such as appointing his horse a senator. The steed was to live in a marble stable, walk around covered in purple and in a harness decorated with precious stones, and eat from an ivory manger. It didn't end there. Caligula decided to provide the horse with complete comfort of life, providing him with a furnished house and servants. Supposedly, he regularly attended feasts given by Caligula. On this occasion, the emperor toasted to the horse's health. According to the account of Suetonius, the Roman biographer Caligula even went so far as to declare war on Neptune himself, the god of the sea. The reason was his disappointment when the Roman fleet encountered a storm during the campaign in Germania. In an act of revenge, the emperor ordered his soldiers to the beach, where they were to attack the sea and the waves with swords and spears. Additionally, he ordered shells to be collected from the beach as a kind of war booty. Lenin's brain. After the death of Vladimir Lenin, the Soviet regime wanted to make his body a permanent monument of the revolution. This task was a challenge because there were many embalming methods, but none could guarantee the long-term preservation of the mummy in perfect condition. Anatomy professor Vladimir Vorobyov undertook this difficult task with the support of another expert, Boris Zbarsky. The men had additional motivation because if the mission had failed, they would most likely have been shot. Before embalming, scientists opened the skull and carefully removed the brain, which they handed over to German neurologist Oskar Vogt. He founded the Brain Institute in Moscow, where the main object of research was Lenin's brain. The regime was almost convinced that there must be some biological basis behind the leader's genius. The scientist used a special device to cut the brain into 7,500 small pieces. Vogt and his Soviet colleagues analyzed sections of the leader's brain for years. However, the results of the research were not revealed until 1993, because it turned out that Lenin's brain was no different from the brains of other people. Alien invasion. First fake news. On October 13, 1938, the American radio station CBS broadcast the radio play The War of the Worlds, directed by Orson Welles. The adaptation of the novel about the Martian invasion of Earth caused panic among thousands of listeners who perceived it as an account of real events. In the first 20 minutes, the show resembled a typical evening radio broadcast. Suddenly, the broadcast was interrupted by a man who introduced himself as Carl Phillips, reporting from Grover's Mill in New Jersey. He talked about the landing of an unidentified object on a farm, from which huge fighting machines soon emerged. The fictional reporter described the first victims of the invasion and the subsequent incoming alien ships in an increasingly emotional tone. Martial law has been declared in New Jersey. Dozens of people died in the first clashes with extraterrestrials. "It's an invasion," the narrator shouted. The sounds of fighting could be heard in the background. The sounds of screams and explosions, combined with Welles's dramatic narration, created an atmosphere of chaos and horror. The listeners, unaware of the fictitious nature of the broadcast, panicked. They ran away from their homes, called the police, prayed, and prepared to fight the invaders. The story of the woman in the church screaming about the destruction of New York and the coming doom only showed the atmosphere of horror. The War of the Worlds became one of the most famous examples of the media's influence on mass panic.